"She's just a useless wife," my husband said in open court, not angrily, not emotionally, like he was reading a conclusion he'd already reached years ago. I stayed silent. The judge didn't respond right away. He looked past my husband and focused on his attorney instead. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with curiosity. Then he asked a question that cut through the room. "Counselor," he said, "are you certain you understand who Mrs. Morrison is and what she actually does?" My husband stiffened. His attorney hesitated. And for the first time that morning, David Morrison's confidence cracked. The clock above the judge's bench read 9,014 a.m. when David finished speaking. Courtroom 5C of the King County Courthouse was smaller than people imagine when they think of court. No dramatic echo, no gallery packed with spectators, just worn wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of paper and disinfectant that clings to government buildings no matter how often they're cleaned. I sat at the respondent's table with my hands folded, palms resting flat against the surface. I'd learned years ago that clenched fists invite interpretation. Still, hands don't. My name is Sarah Grace Morrison. I'm 48 years old. I've been married to David for 24 years. And until 3 weeks before this hearing, no one had ever suggested out loud in writing or otherwise that I was incapable of managing my own life. David stood a few feet away from me, angled toward the judge. Charcoal suit, expensive watch, the confident posture he wore whenever he wanted to look authoritative but concerned. He had practiced this version of himself carefully. I recognized it because I'd lived with it for decades. His attorney, Marcus Reed, had just finished outlining his petition. He described David as a husband who had carried the financial and emotional responsibilities of the household for years. He described me as withdrawn, passive, and chronically disengaged from long-term planning. He emphasized concern, stability, protection. Then David delivered the sentence he clearly saved for impact. "She's just a useless wife," he said. "She doesn't understand finances. She never has." He didn't look at me when he said it. I didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt, but because reacting would have served his narrative. David had always believed silence meant emptiness. He mistook restraint for absence. That misunderstanding was the foundation of everything that followed. Judge Thomas Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair. He was in his mid-60s, salt and pepper hair, neatly trimmed, reading glasses balanced low on his nose. He had the calm, economical presence of someone who had heard thousands of stories and learned how to spot the seams where they didn't quite hold. He didn't look at me. He looked at Marcus. "Counselor," he said evenly, "are you confident that you understand Mrs. Morrison's professional background?" Marcus blinked. "Yes, Your Honor. She stayed home with the children, domestic duties, I believe." The judge tilted his head just a fraction. "And you're certain that's the full picture?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for the room to notice. David turned toward me then, his expression tightened just slightly. He wasn't afraid yet, but something had shifted. I had not planned for this moment to arrive so early. I had expected to sit quietly through another hour of testimony before anything changed. But Judge Bennett had a habit, one I recognized from watching him preside over unrelated matters years earlier. When something didn't add up, he asked direct questions sooner rather than later. That habit was the reason I was there. 3 weeks earlier, David had filed an emergency petition asking the court to appoint him as the temporary financial conservator over me. Not over my father, over me. He claimed I was unable to recognize exploitation, unable to manage assets responsibly, and emotionally impaired by long-standing disengagement. Within 48 hours of that filing, my personal accounts were frozen pending review. My consulting clients placed me on indefinite hold out of caution. My access to certain professional networks was suspended. The word incompetent hadn't been spoken yet, but it hovered. I did not protest publicly. I did not accuse David. I did not call family members to argue my case. Instead, I've spent most of my adult life working in forensic accounting and financial fraud detection, not the flashy kind. I don't chase headlines or testify regularly in courtrooms. I support investigations. I review financial systems. I document inconsistencies and advise companies when something feels off. Occasionally, rarely, I've been asked to explain findings in legal proceedings. Quiet work, uncelebrated work, work. David had always dismissed as hobby accounting. When my father, Robert Chin, suffered a mild stroke 8 months earlier, David had offered to handle the logistics, appointments, accounts, documents. He said it would take pressure off me while I focused on caregiving. I let him. Robert trusted David. Or perhaps he trusted the marriage. Either way, papers were signed during periods of fatigue. Accounts were accessed for convenience. David became the point of contact for institutions that had once dealt directly with my father. Then Robert died. 3 weeks after the funeral, David's petition arrived. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to my husband describe me as useless, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, but clarity. David wasn't improvising. This was a plan that required me to remain exactly who he believed I was. Quiet, unobservant, disengaged. He didn't realize that silence had never meant I wasn't paying attention. Judge Bennett tapped his pen lightly against the bench. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, finally turning to me, "you've remained silent so far. Is that intentional?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" I met his gaze. "Because this petition depends on assumptions, and assumptions tend to collapse when facts are introduced too early." The courtroom stilled. David inhaled sharply. Judge Bennett studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "Miss Patterson, you may proceed when ready." Linda Patterson, my attorney, rose slowly from her seat, and David Morrison, for the first time since filing that petition, looked uncertain. The first time David called me useless, it wasn't in court. It was at our kitchen table years earlier on an evening that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. Emma had just left for college. Jake was still in high school. The house felt quieter than it ever had, like it was waiting for something we didn't know how to name. David stood at the counter, sorting mail, flipping envelopes with quick, irritated movements. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "So, what's your plan?" he asked. For what I said. He sighed, sharp and theatrical. "For everything, Sarah, for your career, for us, you just float." I remember nodding. I remember saying nothing. At the time, I thought restraint was maturity. I thought silence kept arguments from becoming scars. What I didn't understand yet was that silence can be repurposed. Over time, David turned it into evidence. Our marriage had always run on parallel tracks. We shared a house, raised children, coordinated schedules, but our inner lives rarely intersected. David liked visibility. He thrived on being seen as competent, admired, indispensable. I liked systems. I liked order. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could trace it back to its source. He handled people. I handled processes. At least that's how it started. Gradually, David took over anything that required a signature. He moved our savings to a different bank without telling me. He added himself as the primary contact on our insurance. He told the kids to ask him about money because Mom doesn't like dealing with that stuff. When I pushed back gently, he framed it as reluctance. "You hate responsibility," he'd say. "I'm helping you." And because I didn't want to fight, I let it go. The shift with my father happened quietly. Robert had always been meticulous with his finances. He balanced his checkbook every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, 2 sugars, a splash of milk. He kept receipts in labeled envelopes. He liked knowing where every dollar went. After my mother died, he told me, "Paper is memory. Don't lose it." When he started forgetting small things, I noticed before David did. Or maybe David noticed and didn't say anything. Either way, David stepped in with confidence that felt reassuring at first. He scheduled appointments. He spoke to the bank. He told me he'd take care of the boring parts. "You already do enough," he said. "Let me handle this." Robert trusted him. David was family. He was warm, attentive, capable. When David brought documents to sign, Robert didn't question them. He was tired. He was recovering. He assumed good faith. I assumed it too. The first red flag came months later when David mentioned casually that he'd been moving things around to simplify Robert's accounts. I asked what he meant. He waved it off. "Just housekeeping," he said. "You don't need to worry, but worry is a habit you don't unlearn easily." After Robert's funeral, the house filled with the usual rituals, casseroles, sympathy cards, conversations that never quite reached the point. David took charge. He coordinated with the funeral home. He handled phone calls. He thanked people on my behalf. 3 weeks later, I received the petition. It arrived by courier thick, an official addressed to me by my full name. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before opening it, watching condensation bead on the windshield. When I finally read the words, "Financial incapacity, emergency conservatorship," they felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. David was asking the court to appoint him as my temporary financial guardian. Not because I had made reckless decisions, not because I had lost money, but because, according to him, I was unable to recognize exploitation. The irony didn't escape me. Within days, my accounts were frozen pending review. My consulting clients paused contracts out of an abundance of caution. No accusation, no explanation, just suspension. Years of steady work reduced to a waiting period. Emma stopped returning my calls. Jake sent a single text. "Dad says you need help." That night, I slept in the guest room. David didn't ask me to. He didn't need to. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started where I always did with records. I didn't accuse David. I didn't confront him. I didn't call family members to defend myself. I pulled bank statements. I requested transaction histories. I built a timeline. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly if you're patient. It took most of the day before I noticed the alignment. Small withdrawals, consulting fees, transfers just under reporting thresholds, all clustered around specific dates. Dates! David had visited my father alone. I highlighted them, cross-referenced them, built a spreadsheet. By the end of the week, I had identified multiple transactions totaling tens of thousands of dollars that did not correspond to any documented expense. When I asked David about one of them carefully, neutrally, he smiled. "Don't worry about it," he said. I've got it under control. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not betrayal, recognition. David didn't see himself as stealing. He saw himself as correcting an imbalance. He believed he deserved control because he believed he had carried us for years, and he believed truly that I would never notice. That belief was the most dangerous thing he carried into court, because silence once mistaken for absence becomes a liability, and David had built his entire case on the assumption that I had none. I didn't go back to my father's house right away. That surprised even me. For days after the petition arrived, I stayed in our home, moving through rooms that suddenly felt provisional. David was careful during that time. Not kind careful. He spoke slowly as if volume alone might trigger something fragile in me. He reminded me of appointments I didn't have. He offered to handle things I hadn't asked him to touch. He was building a record, so I waited. When I finally drove to Robert's house, it was a gray Thursday morning, the kind of Pacific Northwest gray that flattens everything, makes colors recede. Bellevue was quiet, the neighborhood unchanged, in ways that felt almost accusatory. Same craftsman homes, same hedges trimmed just enough. Same sidewalks my father used to sweep every Saturday like someone might be grading him. I parked in the driveway and sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. The house didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a life paused mid-sentence. I let myself in. The air smelled like sandalwood and old books. Robert's smell. The living room was tidy but lived in. A throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch. A stack of library books on the side table. His reading glasses upside down exactly where he always left them. I went straight to the spare bedroom. Robert kept his records in a 4-drawer filing cabinet, beige and unremarkable. Utilities, medical, banking, taxes. He labeled everything in neat block letters. After my mother died, he told me, "If something happens to me, you'll know where to look." I opened every drawer. At first, nothing looked wrong. Statements were there, correspondence, copies of checks, but after an hour, patterns began to fray, envelopes resealed, statements out of sequence, gaps where originals should have been. I pulled everything onto the bed and started sorting by date. That was when I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It sat in a folder marked legal filed neatly between older documents. Robert's signature was there, real, uneven, in a way that matched the weeks after his stroke. The language was broad, too broad. It granted authority over financial decisions without meaningful limitation. But what caught my attention wasn't the scope. It was the timing. The document was signed on a day Robert's neurologist had noted increased confusion. Not incompetence, just vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable, enough to make pressure effective. I photographed the document and kept searching. The journal came later. It was tucked between 2 photo albums in the hall closet, a brown leather notebook worn soft at the edges, the kind of thing you don't buy by accident. Robert had always liked objects that lasted. The first entry was dated 15 months before his death. David called today. It read, said he wanted to help more. Sounded sincere. I want to believe it. The entries were short at first. Dates, visits, notes about fatigue. David bringing groceries. David asking questions about accounts. Then the tone shifted. Foggy day. David had papers. Said they were to help him talk to the bank. I signed. Shouldn't have. Too tired to argue. 2 weeks later. Better day. Looked at papers. Power of attorney. I didn't mean to give that. Embarrassed. Don't want to trouble Sarah. My chest tightened. The last entry was addressed to me. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, not crying, just breathing. When I left the house, I took copies of everything. Originals stayed where they were. Evidence matters more when it hasn't been disturbed. That afternoon, I called Linda Patterson. Linda didn't react emotionally when I told her what I'd found. She asked questions, precise ones, dates, names, medical context. She listened the way investigators listen, without interrupting, without filling silence. "This isn't about notary fraud," she said when I finished. "It's about exploitation during vulnerability." "That's worse," I said. "Yes," she replied, "which is why we have to be careful." She explained how these cases actually unfold. Adult Protective Services gets involved. Banks flag irregular activity. Courts look at capacity on a spectrum, not a binary. David's petition wasn't just aggressive, it was risky. If the court believed Robert had been vulnerable, everything David touched would be scrutinized. "What do you want to do?" Linda asked. I thought of the journal, of my father's careful handwriting, of the way he protected himself without confrontation. "I want the truth to surface on its own," I said, without me forcing it. Linda was quiet for a moment, then we wait and we prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately within David's expectations. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I answered his attorney's questions minimally during the preliminary deposition. When asked about my work, I described it plainly. No embellishment, no credentials volunteered. Freelance bookkeeping, consulting support, financial review. David watched the deposition via video link. I saw him relax as it progressed. He smiled when I answered simply. He nodded when I didn't explain myself. He mistook restraint for surrender. In the background, Linda worked. She requested bank records through proper channels. She coordinated with compliance officers who flagged transactions that didn't match stated purposes. She quietly alerted Adult Protective Services, triggering a parallel review, not an accusation, an inquiry. By the time the hearing approached, multiple systems were moving independently. That was important. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on one voice. The night before the hearing, I returned to Robert's house one last time. I didn't go inside. I sat in my car, parked along the curb, watching the porch light cast a familiar glow. I thought about how my father had prepared for this without knowing exactly how it would unfold. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused. He had left a trail. In court the next morning, when David spoke and Marcus repeated his narrative, I stayed silent. When Judge Bennett asked his question, when the room paused, I understood that we had reached the point my father had anticipated, the point where quiet work begins to speak for itself. Courtroom 5C felt different after the judge's question. Not louder, not tense in the way people expect. It felt alert, as if the room itself had leaned forward, waiting to see which version of reality would hold. Judge Bennett didn't rush. He adjusted his glasses, glanced once at the case file in front of him, then looked directly at Linda Patterson. "Ms. Patterson," he said, "you may proceed." Linda stood slowly. No dramatics, no pacing. She placed one hand on the table, grounding herself, and spoke in a tone that suggested she wasn't here to argue, only to clarify. "Your Honor," Linda began, "this petition is built on the assertion that Mrs. Morrison lacks the capacity to recognize financial exploitation. What we intend to show is that the opposite is true, and that the exploitation occurred because someone believed she wouldn't notice. She started with the bank records. Not all of them, just enough. A simple timeline appeared on the monitor. Dates on the left, transactions on the right, withdrawals, transfers, and payments labeled as administrative support and consulting. Nothing flashy, nothing obviously criminal on its own. These transactions, Linda said, pointing to the screen, occurred over a 10-month period. Each coincides with a visit by Mr. Morrison to Robert Chin's residence. Not to medical appointments, not to banks, to the residence. Marcus Reed rose halfway out of his seat. Objection. Overruled, Judge Bennett said calmly. Proceed. Linda didn't linger. Next, she said, we addressed the power of attorney. She did not accuse David of forging it. Instead, she framed it clinically. This document was executed on a date when Mr. D.V. Chin's neurologist documented increased confusion and reduced executive functioning, not incompetence. Vulnerability. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. In Washington State, Linda continued, capacity is not binary. Consent obtained during vulnerability, especially without independent counsel, requires scrutiny. David crossed his arms tightly. Linda moved on. After execution of this document, Mr. Morrison gained expanded access to Mr. Chin's accounts. That access coincides with a marked change in transaction behavior. She clicked to the next slide. Prior to this date, Mr. Chin's spending patterns were consistent for over a decade. Utilities, groceries, pharmacy. Afterward, we see discretionary withdrawals with no corresponding invoices, no medical billing, and no documentation supporting their stated purpose. Marcus objected again. This time, his voice lacked confidence. Judge Bennett overruled him without looking up. Linda paused. Your Honor, she said before proceeding further, I believe context is important. She turned slightly toward me. Mrs. Morrison, she said, can you explain briefly what your role has been professionally for the last 20 years? I stood. I work in forensic accounting and financial fraud detection, I said. I help organizations identify irregular financial behavior and systemic weaknesses. Most of my work happens before anything becomes public. Have you testified in court? The judge asked. Yes, I said a few times. When companies needed to explain findings, not frequently. Judge Bennett nodded. He turned back to Marcus. Counselor, he said, was this background included in your assessment of Mrs. Morrison's capacity? Marcus hesitated. We understood her role to be limited. That, Judge Bennett replied evenly, appears to be an assumption. David stood abruptly. She doesn't like attention, he said sharply. She hides behind spreadsheets. That doesn't make her competent. Judge Bennett raised the hand. Mr. Morrison, sit down. David didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. Linda resumed. She did not introduce the journal yet. Instead, she presented a summary from Adult Protective Services, not a conclusion. An inquiry? APS had been notified. A preliminary review had begun. Banks had flagged irregularities independently. This court, Linda said, was asked to intervene because Mr. Veeam. Morrison claimed his wife could not recognize exploitation, yet multiple institutions did so without her prompting. The judge's expression changed. Ms. Patterson, he said slowly, are you suggesting that this petition itself triggered a broader review? Yes, Your Honor, and that review is ongoing. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Judge Bennett folded his hands. "Mr. Morrison," he said, turning to David, "you requested emergency authority over your wife's finances. Based on what I've heard, that request appears premature." David opened his mouth, then closed it. "I am denying the petition," Judge Bennett continued with prejudice. He paused. "And given the evidence presented and the independent inquiries now underway, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for further review." The words landed softly, but they landed. David's shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in calculation. He had lost control of the timeline. Judge Bennett looked at me again. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "you were right to remain silent." I nodded once. As the gavel struck, I felt no surge of triumph, only a sense of alignment, like something that had been skewed was finally straightened. Outside the courtroom, Linda leaned toward me. "This part is over," she said quietly. "The next part won't be." I knew that, because when systems begin to move, they rarely stop at the first truth they uncover. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final but wasn't. Outside, the air carried the sharp edge of early spring, cold enough to keep people moving. Not cold enough to excuse staying inside. Linda walked beside me toward the parking lot, her pace measured. "The petition's denied," she said, "but that's not the end of this." "I know," I replied. What surprised me was how little relief I felt. The denial had lifted an immediate threat, but it hadn't restored anything David had taken. Accounts were still under review. My clients were still cautious. My children were still caught between versions of the same story. And now the systems had noticed. Within 48 hours, the audit expanded. It didn't happen dramatically. There were no sirens, no confrontations. Banks simply did what banks are trained to do when Adult Protective Services opens a preliminary inquiry. They widened the scope. Robert's accounts were examined alongside any joint accounts David had access to. Transaction histories were requested going back years, not months. Patterns were compared across institutions. Linda called me that night. "APS is involved formally now." She said, "They're not accusing, they're documenting." That matters. "Does David know?" I asked. "Not yet," Linda said, "but he will." David didn't come home that evening. Instead, he sent a text, short, clipped, performative. "We need to talk. You embarrassed me today." I didn't respond. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. "Emma!" Her voice was tight, controlled in the way people sound when they're trying not to choose sides. "Dad says the judge overreacted," she said. "He says you set this up." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "What do you think?" She paused long enough for me to hear traffic through the phone. "I don't know," she admitted. "He's always handled things. You've always stayed out of it." "That's not the same as not paying attention," I said. She exhaled. "Jake's upset. He hasn't called," I said. "He's scared," Emma replied. "Dad told him to stay out of it." That tightened something in my chest. "Tell him he doesn't have to choose," I said. "He just has to tell the truth to himself, if no one else." Emma didn't answer right away. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll tell him." We hung up and the house felt cavernous. Later that afternoon, Linda forwarded an email from a bank compliance officer. The tone was neutral procedural. The content wasn't. Multiple transactions had been flagged as inconsistent with stated purposes. Several payments routed through a third-party consulting entity raised concerns due to lack of licensure and supporting documentation. A request for additional information had been sent to the account holder, David. He'll panic, Linda said when I called her. That's when mistakes happen. I didn't want David to panic. Panic makes people unpredictable. I wanted him to explain. Explanations leave trails. 2 days later, APS contacted me directly. A caseworker named Patricia Wells introduced herself over the phone. Her voice was calm, practiced. "We're conducting a standard review related to Robert Chin's account," she said. "We'll need to speak with you and your husband separately." "Of course," I replied. Patricia asked about Robert's habits, his routines, his independence before the stroke. I answered carefully, truthfully. I didn't accuse David. I described facts, dates, observations. Patricia took notes and thanked me. "We'll be in touch," she said. David came home that night late, carrying tension he didn't try to hide. "They're questioning me," he snapped, dropping his briefcase on the table. "Banks, some social worker. This is your fault." I looked at him. He looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but compressed by the weight of scrutiny. "This is the result of your petition," I said evenly. "You asked for oversight." He scoffed. "I asked to protect the family." "By declaring me incompetent," I replied. His eyes flashed. "You are incompetent, Sarah? You don't understand how things work." I almost smiled. Almost. "Tell them that I said." He stared at me, then turned away, jaw clenched. The next week stretched thin. APS interviewed David. Banks requested clarifications. Linda coordinated with investigators, careful not to interfere. My clients extended my contract hold, citing ongoing external review. No promises, no timelines. Emma visited once briefly. She sat on the edge of the couch and avoided my eyes. "He won't answer questions directly," she said quietly. "Dad, he keeps saying people are twisting things." "Do you believe him?" I asked. She hesitated. "I don't know what to believe." "That's honest," I said. Jake called 2 nights later. His voice shook. "Mom, I think I messed up." "You didn't," I said immediately. "Whatever it is." He told me he'd seen David wearing Robert's watch months earlier. Family heirloom. David had said Robert gave it to him. Jake hadn't questioned it at the time. Now he wasn't sure. "I didn't tell anyone," Jake said. "I was afraid Dad would be mad." "You can tell APS," I said gently. "You don't have to accuse. Just say what you saw." He sniffed. "Will it ruin everything?" I thought about Robert's journal, about quiet preparation. "No," I said, "it clarifies things." The audit findings came in pieces, not all at once. Each piece aligned with the next. Transfers routed through a third party, payments justified vaguely, documentation created after the fact. Then Linda called me one evening, her voice lower than usual. "They identified the intermediary," she said, "a man named Thomas Burke. Not licensed, not bonded. He's been contacted by investigators." "Did he respond?" I asked. "Yes," Linda said carefully with counsel. "That mattered. It meant Thomas wasn't acting impulsively. It meant this would unfold the way real cases do, slowly, deliberately, with consequences measured in months, not moments." Linda paused. "Sarah," she said, "be prepared. This will take time. Relationships won't snap back. Some things won't return to what they were." I looked around the kitchen, the same table where David had once called me useless, the same quiet corners where assumptions had hardened into truth. "I'm not looking for everything to go back," I said. "I'm looking for things to be honest." "That's usually harder," Linda replied. When I hung up, I sat alone with that thought. Honesty doesn't rush. It accumulates, and once it does, It doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. The call from Linda came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that pretends to be ordinary until you answer it. They've contacted Thomas Burke formally, she said. With counsel present, he hasn't confessed to anything, but he's cooperating. I sat at the dining table. My laptop closed the house quiet in that way it had learned to be. What does that mean exactly? It means he's answering narrowly, Linda replied, providing records when compelled. No speeches, no texts. This is how people protect themselves when they realize the ground has shifted. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That was consistent with everything I'd seen so far. People who think they're in control improvise. People who know they're exposed follow procedures. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded in small, methodical steps. APS completed its initial assessment and referred the matter to the county. Bank compliance units issued follow-up requests. Subpoenas were drafted. Not dramatic, just precise. Every request pulled another thread. David tried to regain control by appearing cooperative. He attended interviews. He answered emails promptly. He framed every transfer as a misunderstanding, every payment as administrative necessity. He leaned heavily on the idea that Robert had wanted things handled quietly and that I had never taken an interest. Investigators listened. Then they compared notes. The pattern didn't change. What changed was David's tone. He stopped calling me incompetent and started calling me manipulative. He told Emma I was weaponizing my job. He told Jake I was letting outsiders tear the family apart. Each version contradicted the last. Each conversation left more residue. Emma withdrew. She didn't defend him anymore, but she didn't confront him either. When she visited, she spoke in fragments, questions without conclusions. I let her. Loyalty isn't something you pull apart quickly without doing damage. Jake, on the other hand, started talking. Not all at once, not easily. He described moments he hadn't thought mattered. His father asking him to run errands to the bank instructions, to keep conversations vague, reminders to stay out of grown-up stuff. None of it was incriminating on its own together. It sketched intent. Linda cautioned me not to draw conclusions aloud. "Let them assemble the picture," she said. "Your job is to remain consistent." That consistency mattered when the district attorney's office finally reached out. Assistant District Attorney Michelle Torres requested a meeting. No accusations, just a conversation. Linda and I met her in a modest conference room downtown. Michelle didn't waste time. "We're looking at potential charges related to financial exploitation of an elderly adult," she said. "Possibly fraud, possibly forgery, depending on how certain documents were used." I asked the only question that mattered. "What happens next?" "Evidence review," she replied. "Witness cooperation. If charges are filed, we'll offer a plea. If not accepted, we proceed." She looked at me carefully. "This won't be quick." "I'm not in a hurry," I said. That night, David finally confronted me directly. He waited until the house was quiet, until the children were gone, until it felt safe to control the narrative again. "You did this," he said, standing across from me in the living room. "You could have stopped this at any point." I looked at him, not angrily, not defensively. "I didn't start it," I said, "and I can't stop what I didn't create." He laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You always hide behind that procedure systems. You act like you're above this." "I'm not above it," I replied. "I'm inside it." His expression shifted then, not to fear exactly, but to calculation. "They won't put me in prison," he said. "Not for this." I didn't answer. 2 weeks later, David was charged. The indictment listed counts under Washington law related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraudulent documentation. Not the maximum charges, not the minimum, enough to anchor the case. He was not arrested in a dramatic sweep. He was notified through counsel and surrendered voluntarily. The process was procedural, predictable, public record, but not spectacle. Marcus Reed withdrew as his attorney the following day. The plea negotiations took months. David rejected the first offer, then the second. He insisted on explanations that contradicted the evidence. He blamed stress. He blamed marriage. He blamed me. Finally, the paper trail closed the remaining exits, the transfers, the intermediary, the timing, the power of attorney executed during documented vulnerability, the absence of independent counsel for Robert, the inconsistencies David could no longer reconcile. He accepted a plea to a Class B felony. The sentence reflected what these cases often do when the numbers are significant, but the defendant has no prior convictions. A suspended prison sentence, 3 years contingent on compliance, 5 years of probation, full restitution with interest, mandatory financial disclosure, and a permanent prohibition from acting as a fiduciary or managing another person's assets. To satisfy restitution, David was required to liquidate assets. The investment property went on the market, not ours, his, a property he'd purchased quietly the year before under the name of a trust he could no longer justify. I wasn't present when the judge accepted the plea. Linda was. She called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I sat at the kitchen table and let that settle. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight redistribution, like something heavy had finally been placed where it belonged. The consequences extended outward. My clients reinstated me, but not immediately. There was a probationary period, additional disclosures, quiet monitoring, no punishment, just caution. I accepted it. Some systems forgive slowly. Emma took longer. She oscillated between anger and grief, not always sure which belonged where. We talked. We didn't resolve everything. That wasn't the point. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't follow verdicts. Jake began therapy, then asked if I'd come with him to a session. I did. David sent a letter through his attorney months later. Shorter this time. Still no apology, just regret shaped like self-defense. I didn't respond. Some conversations don't require closure. They require distance. One evening, after the house had quieted again, I opened Robert's journal and read the last entry once more. If you're reading this he'd written, it means you didn't look away. I closed the book. The systems had spoken. Now it was my turn to live with what they'd said. The first time I woke up and realized the case was truly over. Nothing felt different. No rush of relief, no sense of triumph, just quiet. It was early before 6. The house was still the kind of stillness that used to make me uneasy. I lay there listening to it, realizing that for the first time in over a year, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to be broken. The plea had been entered 3 weeks earlier, the paperwork finalized, restitution schedules approved, probation terms set. David was no longer fighting, not because he had accepted responsibility, but because there were no moves left that didn't make things worse. Justice, when it comes, rarely announces itself. It settles in like weather. The financial consequences were slower. Lawyers had to be paid. Audits had costs. Even with restitution, ordered money doesn't return all at once. I sold my father's house in Bellevue in late autumn, not because I wanted to, but because it made sense, because holding on to it would have meant clinging to something that had already served its purpose. On the last day before closing, I walked through the empty rooms one final time. The house echoed, not with ghosts, just with absence. I stood in the kitchen where Robert had once balanced his checkbook every Sunday morning, 2 sugars in his coffee, a small notebook always open beside him. I took the journal from my bag and placed it on the counter. I didn't look away, I said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Then I closed the door. Work resumed gradually. My clients reinstated me with conditions, additional oversight, periodic disclosures, a quiet reminder that trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild, even when you're not the one who caused the fracture. I accepted that without resentment. Systems don't run on emotion. They run on consistency. And I knew how to be consistent. Emma didn't come around right away. Months passed where our conversation stayed careful, almost scripted. She was polite. She asked about work. She avoided talking about her father. I didn't push. Loyalty doesn't vanish. Just because facts arrive, it has to unwind on its own. The turning point came unexpectedly. She called one evening and asked if I still had Robert's old recipe box. I found something, she said. She came over that weekend and pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. A bank notice dated years earlier, addressed to Robert, forwarded to David's email. I found it in Grandpa's old files, Emma said quietly. He never mentioned it. I don't know why. I looked at her at the way her hand shook just slightly as she held the paper. It's okay, I said. You don't have to fix this. I know, she replied. I just needed you to know. I see it now. That was enough. Jake's healing looked different. Therapy helped. Distance helped. He didn't excuse David, but he didn't sever himself completely either. He learned slowly that loving someone doesn't require defending their choices. Watching him learn that taught me something too. David never apologized. He complied. He attended mandated sessions. He paid restitution. He followed probation terms. But remorse, real remorse, requires looking inward, and David had spent too long outsourcing that work. I stopped expecting it. Months later, I received one final letter, not from David, but from the court clerk, confirmation that restitution had been completed, that Robert's estate was officially closed. That chapter sealed. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with nothing spread out in front of me. No documents, no timelines, no spreadsheets, just a cup of coffee and the quiet I'd once mistaken for emptiness. I thought about the word useless, how easily it had been said, how confidently it had been believed. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Calm doesn't mean weakness. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it too. David thought my quiet made me invisible. He thought my restraint meant disengagement. He thought paper was something you could rearrange without consequence. He forgot that paper remembers. If you're still here, thank you for listening, for staying with this story through its uncomfortable parts. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly erased by someone who thought you wouldn't notice, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there. These stories don't exist in isolation. They live in the spaces we recognize ourselves. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories about dignity and the long arc of quiet justice, subscribe. There are more ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.